Here's a No King's Day reality check. Have you heard this idea that if 3.5% of a population protests nonviolently, social change is a slam dunk? The nonviolence part of that is a real problem. So if you're like me, you may have grown up with the term nonviolence shining like a pole star over every discussion of how we can accomplish sociopolitical change. But what does it really mean? And who defines violence beyond the police, the courts, and others in power? The term nonviolence seems to have a spiritual glow to it, reflective of its origins in the saintly persona of Gandhi, who was no saint, but that's another story. As a younger person, my progressive Catholic milieu drew me to people who walked that path in their civil rights and Vietnam struggles, people like Thomas Merton and Daniel Berrigan. And I came to believe that embodying a kind of noble and peace-loving faith in the long arc of history bending toward justice was the only real power that changed history. And along with this came a very pious self-image that mapped onto the iconic photos of hippies placing flowers in the rifle barrels of riot cops in the hope of spontaneous collective awakening. Now today, the theory of nonviolence has grown beyond its spiritual aspiration roots while retaining what I would describe as its irrational faith. It is now a think tank approved, purportedly evidence-based method that guarantees movement success. Now that reasoning comes to us through the scholarship of the pacifist Gene Sharp in the 1960s and his inheritors in the strategic nonviolence discourse, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who implicitly argue that Gandhi's sacred ideal of satyagraha also happens to be the only successful pathway to lasting change, and they say they have the data to prove it. They basically secularize an Indian wisdom idea. Now, I remember when their 2011 book swept through the activist world, so many people wanted to believe that it was true. But do they really have the empirical data? Ben Case is a longtime researcher. In his book, Street Rebellion, Resistance Beyond Violence and Nonviolence, he dug into this new secular rationalization for the cultural logic that all successful civil resistance is nonviolent. And what he found was that Sharp, Chenoweth, and Stephan not only didn't do any field work on the topic and basically ignored the history of anti-colonial struggle, they also worked with deceptively bad data, which failed to distinguish armed violent resistance, i.e. military force, from non-armed violent resistance. Now, this meant that they wound up classifying all kinds of movements that applied non-armed force, like rioting, property destruction, and sabotage, as being non-violent because they didn't involve firearms and didn't cause more than 1,000 casualties. So Case exposes dozens of examples of this dodgy work. I'm just going to give one. Chenoweth and Stephan categorized the political campaign known as the Bulldozer Rebellion as nonviolent and successful. This was the uprising that ousted Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in 2000. Now, why do they call it the Bulldozer Rebellion? Because Serbian protesters used a bulldozer to smash through police lines, and then they burned government buildings during climactic protests that actually toppled the government. Dodgy claims be damned. Chenoweth rode them to their current chair position as academic dean at the Harvard Kennedy School, which happens to have an enormous influence on US domestic policy. But they have also acknowledged the substance of Case's criticism because he's right. To me, the damage is done because now a big block of progressives and liberals have come to believe that civil resistance is only ever effective if people absolutely avoid actions that Sharp and Chenoweth obscured in their popular studies. Throwing things, property damage, fighting with police to de-arrest comrades, and rioting. They ignored the time-honored principle of the bottom line is that movements we think of as being nonviolent never really are. They are messy, emotional, and usually feature various levels of forceful resistance that can catalyze broader support and galvanize the dignity and will of an oppressed people. Further, I believe that the premise we should all remain calm and protest in an orderly fashion with our signs in one hand and our lattes in the other, or else we'll mess it all up, can make people tentative and afraid, perhaps naively faithful in the premise that fascists will concede power because we're asking them to. I want to be very clear. I'm not advocating for anything other than for us all getting clearer about where violence really comes from, who defines it, and what the feeling of the term nonviolence conveys. Now, if you're clear on that, and if you're committed to pacifism, come what may, God bless you, there is a place for that. But if you know that your moral commitments can be pushed to the point of pushing back with your body, there's a place for that too, morally and historically. Don't let anybody tell you that you are scientifically wrong about rejecting absolute pacifism. Maybe ask yourself, who would want you to believe in the scientific truth of absolute pacifism?